Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience. We were working on some technical difficulties. One of our speakers, I'll let you guess which one is on a whaling ship off of the coast of Massachusetts. Hi, I'm Bernard Schwartz. I'm the director of the Unterberg Poetry Center here at the 92nd Street Y. And the occasion for this event, conversation between Paul Giamatti and Andrew Delbanco, is our recent release of Paul's recorded reading of Melville's Bartleby, the Scrivener. If you're watching this right now, you've got access to that recording. Maybe you've listened to it already. If not, I encourage you to do so. Speaking of recorded readings and the Y, which has a nice long history presenting Melville's work, I would also draw your attention to two other offerings via the Poetry Center online website. They include a performance in 1998 of Robert Lowell's adaptation of Benito Cereno featuring Frank Langella and Roscoe Lee Brown. We also did a celebration of Melville upon the occasion of Professor Delbanco's biography of Melville in 2005, featuring readings and presentations by, of course, the professor himself, Stanley Crouch, Maureen Howard, and a spectacular reading by Tony Kushner. So when we're done here, you should go there. The way tonight's program will proceed is Paul and Andy will talk for about 40 or 45 minutes. We encourage you also to submit some questions via the chat function. They can be about Melville. They can be about, of course, Professor Delbanco's other scholarship, including his most recent work, The War Before the War. You can also ask Paul about TV and movies and Volkswagen commercials if you like, if you dare. And if we're lucky, Paul may even read a little bit from one of his other favorite Melville texts. That's it from me. I hope you enjoy the show. Thanks for tuning in. Here's Paul and Andy.
Hello. Oops, I can't hear you, Andy.
There we go. How's that?
Well,
okay.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Good.
So I'm thanking Bernard, and I'm saying it's great to meet you virtually.
Likewise.
And my guess is a lot of people who are tuning in are curious in the first instance about the sort of the Giamatti-Melville connection. That is, why Melville for you?
For me?
There's a nice piece in the New Yorker that I think came out with today or yesterday.
Yeah, I think it was today.
Yeah. But if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about what draws you to this writer, and then maybe we'll take it from there.
Oh, interesting. Well, it actually is something that goes pretty far back into my childhood. I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I got a picture book of Moby Dick, a child's version. I mean, amazing to think that somebody adapted it for a child. But and I was very interested in sort of dinosaurs and things, and then I became very interested in whales. So I was interested in these big monstrous things, and here was a crazy white whale monstrous thing. And this book was, somebody probably read it to me, but the pictures were really thrilling. And definitely, I was also very interested in monsters in general. Frankenstein and
human monsters or other kinds?
Well, yeah, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, things like that. And something really keyed into me as a kid, and I realized that the real monster in this book was the guy with one leg and the harpoon, who seemed out of his mind, and in the end was stabbing this thing with blood all over the place. And I became very interested in that. And I have a lot of New England roots and stuff in my family. I grew up in coastal New England, but something about that craziness and the monstrosity and stuff like that as a little kid. And then my whole life, I just kept with that. And
well, it sounds like a very healthy relationship you have with Melville, and it's good of you to be so open about it, right? The monstrosity and all. Yeah. Right.
Well, it was a very childhood thing, but it made sense, you know. It's like that struck a chord, and then as time went on, I realized he's a monster, but he's also very human too, and it just became more and more interesting to me.
Actually, it's amazing. One could make a study of all the adaptations of Moby Dick. I've got a pop-up book that I'm getting ready to give to my 19-month-old granddaughter, but I want to wait a little bit.
Maybe wait a little bit. I actually gave that. I think I gave probably the same pop-up book to my son when he was a kid.
And he's okay with it? Like he's okay now? That's right.
He's okay. He's okay enough. You're probably right. It's probably not the healthiest thing to introduce into a child's brain, Herman Melville. But you know, I can't complain. It's been pretty good stuff.
But as a colleague of mine sometimes says, to lapse into seriousness for a moment.
Yeah.
You know, it's not surprising, I think, that your first encounter with Melville was with the great book Moby Dick in one form or another. And that's the way people usually think of him, as a sort of oceanic writer, who not only sets his stories at sea, also writes at an enormous scale, with a tremendously open, really a vast imagination. And one of the things that has always interested me about this story that we're talking about tonight, how different it is from that Melville.
Yeah.
Go from the wide open sea to this claustrophobic office in what we now would call downtown Manhattan, but which was then really Manhattan.
Yeah, right.
And it's very tight. It's very enclosed.
Yeah.
Very airless.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have thoughts about, you know, what's the relationship between those two writers, even though they're actually the same guy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, this is something, I mean, I'm curious to talk to you about, because it's interesting to me. I always think about, there's a quotation, I think it was Hawthorne who said that he said at one point, I've made up my mind to be annihilated at some point.
Right.
And I've always thought, obviously it wasn't by choice, you know, his writing hadn't gone well. And so he got this job as a customs inspector, right?
Yeah, although that came later.
It did. Okay. Yeah. But there's some interesting recognition of like annihilating yourself in confinement in that way, of sort of cutting yourself off, of sort of entombing yourself in this kind of airless, joyless, faceless world. And that's terrifying. And I always think like, and then it happens to him. And it's so strange. And obviously, like I say, it wasn't by choice, but there must have been some conscious sense of like, now I'm going to annihilate myself this way, right, rather than some other way. But it is interesting because there's a lot of stuff that's similar about them, because he talks about society and privacy in this story so much. And he talks about that stuff in the oceanic stuff too. This kind of, I'm a part of the bigger thing, but I'm this little guy too, who's an individual, and the same thing goes on there. But
yeah, no, well, I think those are great insights. I mean, the thing is, it's not always immediately obvious, but I kind of believe that Melville was fundamentally a New York writer. In spite of his years in New England and years at sea, there was something about him that was a New York sensibility.
Yeah.
He was brash, he was irreverent. He says somewhere in The Confidence Man, that crazy book of his later, that a novelist goes to town to find his characters. Doesn't find him in the countryside.
Right. Right.
And this story is about an urban character.
Right.
Probably a character who reminds us all of someone that we know. So that's part of it. But he had this, like most New Yorkers, I think, he had a love-hate relationship to the city.
Yeah.
You know, he find it confining. And remember at the very beginning of Moby Dick, everybody remember.
Yeah.
He's got that scene of people on the Battery staring out at sea,
looking into the water. Right.
And he describes them as sort of desperate to get out of the office.
Right.
You know,
right.
they're clinched to desks. Clinched to desks.
Yeah.
So here he is a few years after Moby Dick, and he comes in his imagination and he writes a story about people who are clinched to their desks.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
So,
And so he wrote this. Then I'm curious too. So he writes Moby Dick. Then he writes Pierre, which is also kind of about a guy who goes to the city and gets destroyed by going to the city. And then he writes, so the failures of those things then lead him to write to a thing about a guy chained to his desk in some way, right? I mean, those books kind of failed, right?
well, they all failed as commercial properties. He had early success with his stories about the South Seas and cannibals.
Yeah.
But then, often it's the worst thing that can happen to a writer if you have an early success.
Yeah.
Because then the critics come after you with the second book and the third book, and they say, So he was a failed writer as measured by his royalties.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And yes, I think there may be a connection between the portrait of Bartleby and his sense of himself, but I'm frankly a little resistant to reading it that way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. It's interesting. It's funny. It was funny when you just said before about we might recognize this character as being someone we know.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most interesting things for me in reading that story is when you said that, I thought, which character do you mean? You mean Bartleby or the lawyer?
Okay.
And the interesting thing is that when you read it out loud, one of the big discoveries for me in reading it out loud was that character, the lawyer. And in this funny way, when you read it on the page, Bartleby's the star of the story. When you read it out loud, the lawyer is suddenly the guy who's really the story is really about.
Absolutely. I agree.
Really the guy that is really the guy that we may or may not know. And in some way, I don't know, maybe Melville's dilemma is even more the lawyers too. I don't know. This kind of middle-class guy from a good middle-class family. I don't know. But it's interesting that I wonder, which character Melville may be identified with. I don't know.
Well, let's talk about the lawyer
for
a minute, because you do a wonderful job in your reading of imagining his voice.
Yeah.
And so you must have felt that you were getting into his head. I'm not sure, and we'll discover in the course of this conversation, I'm not sure whether your version of the lawyer is quite my version of the lawyer.
I'll be interested to know.
But that's what a great story is all about. It's different responses. So here's this guy, and he describes himself at the beginning of the story as an eminently safe man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's the guy that you can trust him.
Yeah.
Take good care of your most significant documents. And
with all your will and your
and everything else. He's a lawyer you want. And,
right.
Yeah. And then he starts describing the office.
Mm-hmm.
Describes it very meticulously in great detail. And I would say, I don't want to sound too much like an English professor, but the subtitle of the story is A Story of Wall Street.
Yes.
Which is, of course, the name of a street.
Yes.
But also suggests this is about walls.
There's walls everywhere. Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
So very proud of the way he's organized his office, right?
Yeah.
He's got these ground glass doors that you can't really see through.
Yeah.
He can separate himself from his employees.
Yeah.
And his business is picking up.
Yeah.
He needs a third person to help him with his work.
Yes.
And the work that these people are hired to do, I always stop with my students and I say, let's think about what they're asked to do. They copy documents all day.
All day long.
They are,
he says it's dry and dusty work, and they sit there eating crackers and in the cold, endlessly copying, endlessly.
Yeah. So anachronistically, we could say they are human Xerox machines.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, if you think about that, or I ask my students to think about that, that's not a very fulfilling line of work.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And then it turns out that he's got these two employees before Bartleby shows up, right? Turkey and Nippers.
Yeah.
And one of them is functional in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And after lunch, he totally loses it.
Well, he drinks it. He drinks too much. He's an alcoholic. Yeah.
Right. By the afternoon, he's spilling the ink.
Not always useless. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other guy is functional in the afternoon, but in the morning. So I say to my students, okay, here's a guy who's paying a full wage, 2 full-time employees, each of whom is doing a half-time job.
Yeah.
And I put it that way because, as you can tell, I'm kind of sympathetic to this guy.
Yes.
I think he's not a bad boss.
I don't either.
Okay.
I don't think he's a bad guy. I don't think he's a bad guy. There's something, the calculation of saying like, all right, I got an alcoholic and I got another guy and I'll make it work. I'll make it work. He's constantly making everything work. And I don't think he is a bad guy. I don't think he is a bad guy.
So he's showing some human tolerance toward these people, and he doesn't quite say it, but if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you could say he may actually understand what mind-numbing, soul-deadening work these people are being asked to do.
Yes.
So then this third employee, job applicant, shows up. And he seems to meet he checks all the right boxes. He's quiet and orderly and serene. And so he hires him. And you quoted that wonderful line about privacy and society conjoined.
Yeah.
Which, just for the benefit of our audience, to remind them, what he does with Bartleby is he lets him be in his own part of the office, right?
Right.
But he puts up
but he closes him off in the corner.
A shade, so he can hear him, but not have to look at him.
Not have to look at him.
Doesn't want to see him.
No.
Which I think is a significant detail. So and thus he says privacy and society are conjoined.
Yes.
So then, I mean, tell us, you're better to talk about this than I am.
Oh.
Dramatic, mind-bending, transformative moment of the story is the famous words that Bartleby speaks.
Right.
When the lawyer asks him to do a perfectly conventional task.
What everybody's supposed to do.
What he was hired to do.
To
compare copies.
Yeah.
And Bartleby says,
I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to.
Yeah,
I would prefer. Yeah.
Now, when he says that, the lawyer says something, I hate to paraphrase, but he says something. He says, I had to rally my stunned faculties.
Yeah. It completely throws his world off.
Exactly.
It spins everything out of control. How is this possible?
Talk to us about it.
And like you're saying, he's got this well-regulated office. He's managed to make this thing work, and it is working. And he's got all these guys sort of in place, and everybody's sort of happy. But you're right. As much as he cares, he gives Turkey a cast-off coat, his cast-off coat, but he doesn't process that it might offend the guy.
Okay.
And the guy gets a little pissed off, and he goes, "This is a man that prosperity would harm." He doesn't, and this is where he is a good guy, but he's oblivious in some ways too. There's a kind of denial of things like that going on too. Yes. Although he has incredible moments of self-awareness that are kind of
provoked, I think, by Bartleby.
Yes, they are provoked by Bartleby, but they're amazing. And how much he really takes them in or then just avoids them again, because he seems to shut it down every time he has a realization like that. But yes, Bartleby completely spins him off of his game. He can't.
I have my thoughts about why, but I'm interested. So why do those few very genteel, light words, I would prefer not to? Why do they have such a, you could say, violent impact on?
They're ambiguous. It's not an outright denial of something. It's a kind of, there's an ambiguity to them that must be disturbing to the guy.
Right.
There's a gentleness to them. They're not forceful. They're not, I don't know, I hadn't really ever thought about. I had simply thought that it's just, it's a non-functioning cog suddenly in the machine.
Well, I say again that, when I talk with students about this, I try to point out to them, Bartleby doesn't say no.
No, yeah.
And he doesn't say, up yours or something
Yeah,
more.
no.
He says, I would prefer not to.
No, the guy then talks about the passive resistance being more galling than an outright resistance. And that passivity is a thing that really seems to, and the guy is kind of oddly passive himself too. I mean, or at least he can't be active in the face of Bartleby's passivity, but he does talk about the passive resistance being the most annoying possible thing, galling and troubling thing.
What he says, I think this is inaccurate. Nothing so aggravates an earnest man,
right,
as a passive resistance.
That's right.
And that's one of those, there are several moments in the story where there's a sentence that is so sharp, and goes so far beyond the boundaries of the story. I think that's one of them.
Yes.
Anybody who thinks about history knows that passive resistance has proven to be a very potent weapon to change the world.
Yes. Yeah. What is the story with, had Thoreau done his sort of civil disobedience stuff? Had that already happened and all that stuff?
Melville probably wasn't aware of it, but it was happening in Thoreau's mind. But it's a good connection.
Yeah.
I don't think, one of my premises about Melville, there are no accidents in his use of the language.
Yeah.
He uses the term passive resistance. He knows what he's doing.
Right.
But so it opens up, though, the question then, those words signify that something about Bartleby is, as you've said, shaken this guy's world and pushed him off center. How does he start to try to deal with that then?
What does he do? He tries every kind of possible avenue besides throwing the guy out. He tries everything not forthrightly aggressive, and he never really confronts him terribly aggressively until towards the end, but still doesn't even really, still can't sort of bring himself to be too aggressive towards him. But he tries all these different avenues of approach and eventually gives in and just lets the guy stand there in the middle of the room after a while.
And this is why, I'm still not quite sure whether we see the lawyer in the same way, but this is why I actually feel quite sympathetic toward him, because as you just said, he goes to extreme lengths to try to accommodate Bartleby.
Absolutely.
He basically ends up letting him just be there.
He offers to take him home. At one point, he says to him towards the end, "I'll take you home with me."
And if how many of us would be willing to do that?
Absolutely.
Right. But then you said before, and I think that's very right, that he has a certain obliviousness.
That's the thing.
But that starts to, I think what you mean by that is that he regards these people in the office as instruments of his.
But also, I think it's maybe a deliberate oblivion. I think he just doesn't want to have to deal with this painful thing. I don't think that he's, I think we agree. I don't think he's a bad man, but I think he's complicated. And I think he comes to these moments of realization about him. And I think he's constantly trying to figure out, part of the comedy to me is the way he's constantly going, "That's it. I'm done. He's out." And then he goes, "But I couldn't do it. I walked in and saw him and thought, you can't do this to him. You can't make him, and there's an interesting thing that occurred to me when I was reading the story, that I don't know if this is in line with what you're saying or what we're talking about, but it's interesting to me. I kept finding it interesting how often he wants to particularize Bartleby, how much he wants to find out who he is, find out more about him so that he can deal with him. If he can find out who he is, he can deal with him better, because otherwise he's a symbol of something and he can't frickin' deal with that. Yeah. Otherwise, he represents a mass of something he cannot deal with. And the way in which, I don't think he's a bad man because of this, but he doesn't want to deal with it, with that. If he can particularize him, then it's like, great, I can call his family up and put him off, or I can find him another job. But otherwise, he's too big a problem.
Yeah. Well, but I think we're heading in the same direction on this. I mean, what Bartleby does, I think, is make it harder and harder for him not to look at him. Right?
That's right. Literally, yeah.
And if we want to be, I don't want to sound grandiose, but all of us do a pretty good job of not looking at other people.
That's right.
Particularly if they look like a problem.
Yeah.
That we want to have to deal with, and that we rather that they are somebody else's problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but there's that moment in the story which I think is very poignant. When, remember, he's gone downtown. It's a Sunday, I believe. A Sunday.
He's going to church. He's going to church.
The neighborhood is quiet. It's in the neighborhood of Trinity Church, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
He has where he goes as a regular, respectable guy.
Yeah, right.
And he decides to go around to his office to pick up something that he's forgotten. He puts his key in the door, and it meets the resistance.
Yes.
Key from the inside.
The guy's there.
The
guy's there.
And at that moment, he realizes Bartleby is what we would call homeless.
A squatter right now. Yeah.
He lives there.
Yep.
And he then discovers that there are bits of cheese and bread or cracker.
And he's sleeping on the sort of the couch in the corner, the crappy couch in the office.
Right. And when the lawyer realizes that, there's another wonderful line in the story.
Amazing passages in that
line where he says, "What I had seen disqualified me for the time from church going."
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
Which I say to me, I don't want to go listen to the platitudes of the preacher this morning, because I've discovered something here that's really dark.
Yes. And before that, though, he has one of those incredible moments of insight where he says, there's a kind of desolation in a human being that you just can't take. Right. That gets to a point where you go, I cannot. He has that incredible line about his body I could save, but his soul, I don't even want to know about it. Right. And so, and you're right. Then he says, I don't want to go listen to the platitudes. It's complicated, that moment of saying, I don't want to listen to the platitudes, because it's also like, I've had an insight, and it's also like, I got to go home and figure out how to get rid of this guy again. Right. You know? So those two things are happening, I think, at the same time in the guy, which is why he's so amazing, you know, which is why he's such an amazing character.
Yes. And I think that's why the story connects so powerfully after more than 150 years to people living wherever we're living, because we all have this situation in one form or another.
Yeah.
A human problem that is profoundly upsetting because it gives us a glimpse into human suffering.
Yeah. And to our capacity to deal with it too.
Right. And what should I expect of myself in a situation like this? There's one line there too where it connects maybe the Melville of the sea writer with the sea. He compares Bartleby to a bit of wreck
in a rock. That's right. Yeah, the Atlantic.
So he's faced with this question of, I guess I would say, what's my responsibility here?
Yeah.
And in terms of no accidents. So what is he decides in the end, he exhausts all the options.
Mm-hmm.
Bartleby won't come home with him. Bartleby won't explain what's going on with him.
Won't take another job. Yeah.
Right. So he decides, instead of evicting him, he's going to move out himself.
He moves his office. Yeah.
In a way, it makes it feel less cruel.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, I'm just leaving, and see you around.
Yeah.
Rather than having the cops come and drag him off.
Yep. That would be unseemly for everybody.
Right. But then he sets up in his new office, and this guy comes to see him. And I mean, we shouldn't fail to remind our viewers that the story is also very funny.
That's a big key element that I'd like to talk to you about.
It's darkly funny.
It's very funny. I think it's a very fun. The absurdity of this guy standing in the middle of this new lawyer comes in, and there's a dude who just stands in the middle of the room and doesn't go anywhere. The absurdity of it is very dark and very funny. Yes. So
the guy comes to see him, and he says, I love this line. He says, it's like, you were supposed to leave he doesn't say these words, but you were supposed to leave the place broom clean.
Right. Yeah.
You got to clean up, and he didn't leave it broom clean.
No.
There's a guy living there.
There's a dude there. Yeah.
And the new tenant says, you are responsible for the man you left there.
Yeah. And he insists, I know nothing about this guy. I know nothing about him. I know nothing about him.
That's a really,
a
resonant line. You are responsible.
You are responsible for this. Yeah. And he feels responsible for him. I think he does actually feel responsible for him in some way, which is that really terrible moment when he finally finds him in the prison yard, and he says, I want nothing to do with you. And he begins to go, it's not me. It's not me. It's not me. Don't blame me. Don't blame me. It's just, it's horrible.
It's heartbreaking.
But I think but for me, in the reading of it, and maybe in some way that I think you detect that I feel differently about him, is that in the performing of the thing, one of the things I really found and continued to find, and I have a vague idea someday of maybe even trying to perform this someday on a stage, is how funny he is. And he's funny unaware. I mean, sometimes he's funny and he knows it. I mean, he has the incredible line, one of my favorite lines, and he says, I don't want to have him arrested. I'd rather kill him and break him up in the wall than have him arrested. And it's just unbelievable.
We also suggest him at one point. He says, well, perhaps you'd like to accompany a young gentleman on a trip.
Oh, yeah. No, and I can't tell in that moment if he's kidding or not, actually, at that point. But he must be being ironic, and he has to be being sarcastic in that moment. But there is one of the things I think that I came to really appreciate. I actually read some of this story once a long time ago at a thing that I had to do. And it gave me this revelation about his humor, about Melville's humor. And it was a whole different way of thinking about him, was that how much very dark humor there is in it. And so I think in some ways that may be why you detect, maybe because I might be making a little bit more fun of him when I'm reading it. I'm letting him be a bit more of a fatuous ass when I read him than maybe is fair to do to him.
Well, I guess I don't think we disagree very much. I mean, I think he starts out as a fatuous ass for sure.
Yes.
But he gets chastened.
Yeah, he does.
And he begins to see human experience in a wider way.
Yeah, he does.
And there are lines about misery is hidden and way, and therefore we think it doesn't exist.
Amazing.
It's
Amazing.
It's very beautiful and very painful.
And
it culminates then with Bartleby being carted off to the Tombs.
Yeah.
And he keeps visiting. He keeps showing up.
Yeah.
The lawyer does.
He can't stay away.
And then he gets there one day and he's told he sleeps with counselors and kings. He's dead.
Right.
And we get at the very end of the story this fascinating little coda.
Amazing.
Which I'm also interested to know what you make of. The rumor of the dead letter office.
Yeah.
What did you make of that?
Well, the thing that is really amazing in that, well, it's interesting because it's the one bit of information we know about Bartleby. And then you think to yourself that Bartleby has passing through his hands people who may be even worse off than he is. But he says something about, it's a great line about the recognition. There's a great thing where he talks about Bartleby's kind of hauteur, his kind of like his, this sensitive man had to do this job. And, you know, again, it's this kind of amazing realization, but it's a sense, in a sense, Bartleby was handling what the guy doesn't want to handle, which is this mass of dead, miserable, this mass of misery. And in a sense, it's like he did what I can't do. He was forced to do what he did as his job, what I can't even conceive of doing. Yeah. And imagine this guy. And I love that he says, you know, I can't remember the word he uses, but a sensitive man like this, imagine him having to do this. Yeah. The suggestion being that he's not sensitive enough to do something like that. But the idea is he did what I can't do, which is deal with this mass of humanity that's miserable.
No, exactly. And I ask my students to think, you know, what exactly is a dead letter, right? Yeah. It's a place where intensely personal messages, you know, a letter from a parent to a child seeking to reconcile, or a love letter, with a locket of hair. It's the place where those letters go, never to be delivered.
They burn them.
So, you know, it's not clear whether this is an explanation of who Bartleby is, but it's a theory. Mm-hmm. It's a persuasive theory, because if you think of what the experience must be like of handling these undeliverable messages, it's devastating. And there too, I'd suggest, you know, we started with Ahab. Ahab is a guy who has been profoundly wounded. Who has been, as we might say, he's got a serious case of PTSD. Right?
Yeah, interesting. Yes.
So does Bartleby.
Yes.
Bartleby, that's right. Wounded by something.
Yes. And sort of all he can do is just go, please, please, I really would rather not have to do this. You know, and the sense in which this was his job too. It wasn't even sort of like, you know, he was forced to do this in a sense, you know, and it's like, I really, really, and you're right. It's that sense of trauma that can't even work up the strength to be so negative. All it can do is say, please, please don't make me do this. Right. And make me write this endless bullshit that I have to just endlessly, please just don't make me.
Right. And the experience forces the lawyer to actually start thinking about what he does. And it's not a comfortable feeling.
No.
Because what he does starts to make less and less sense to him after he's had this encounter with Bartleby.
Interesting.
The whole rationality of his world, it seems to me, starts to tremble. It's very funny, but it's also very
it's very and that's what's great about it, and that's why it feels of a piece with the kind of humor. It feels like, you know, it becomes like Kafka and like Beckett and stuff like that. You know, it feels like that kind of humor, which is like, it's not laugh out loud falling on the floor. Some of it is, but on the whole, no, it's that kind of bitter, kind of painful thing like that. But, you know, he's amazing because he still persists. You know, it's the final thing that moves him along is his worry that other people are going to think he's weird to have this guy around. And that's what prompts him leaving the office too. It's not just that I can't get rid of Bartleby. It's that I look like a fool now. So it's amazing how much nuance he gets into the guy's voice and into the character. It's really amazing. And it's amazing how much it functions as a dramatic monologue. It's crazy. It's like, I mean, it really, but what you're telling me now is very good, that if I ever do this again, there are things I need to think about.
I love the idea of your, and this is not pre-planned because I didn't know. I love the idea of your doing this as a dramatic piece.
I wonder if it would work somehow. I don't know exactly how it could work. I mean, to have one person do this maybe would be interesting to sort of, but you would have to, I don't know how you do it, but it definitely became interesting to me to think about how to do this as an actual dramatic thing on a stage.
But I knew I would enjoy this, but I love talking with you about this because I think your response to it is vindication of the idea that an old piece of writing by a guy who lived almost 200 years ago,
yeah,
and was describing a world that in some ways is very far from our own, but it connects intimately and immediately to our own experience.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And that's what literature is all about in the end.
Absolutely. But he feels there's something about him. And I mean, this story, you're right. But then at the same time, it's like it's every guy stuck in a cubicle in a, Silicon Valley, I mean, it's everybody just stuck in their dead end job. I mean, it's he has that capacity to be utterly universal and timeless seeming. Just extraordinary. I mean, he really is unbelievable.
We agree on that. I think, I don't know if Bernard is back with us, but there may be some people that.
Is there anybody yet?
There he is.
Hey man.
Guys.
Hi.
Hi.
Are there questions from viewers that you should engage with in the remaining moments?
Yeah, there was one interesting question which I'll pass along, and then a sort of seconding of the request for Paul to read a little something.
Yeah.
The question, it's posed to both of you, is tell us your favorite chapter of Moby Dick and, say something about why that might be.
That's a tough one.
Well, for me, it's actually relatively easy for me. I mean, I have many favorite chapters, but there's an amazing, very short chapter called Nantucket. And consists of a more or less paragraph-long description of a place that Melville has never been. And so it's like a riff by a great jazz musician. He just starts imagining all these characteristics of this place he's never been. Like there's so much sand that it's like one big ink box, and there's so much sun that they sit under toadstools to get out of the sun and into the shade. And there's so little material other than the sand that they collect little bits of driftwood the way believing Catholics collect bits of the true cross of Rome. He just goes off on this associative adventure in his mind, and at the end of the whole thing, he says, and all these extravaganzas, I'm doing this from memory, I don't have it open, only say that Nantucket is no Illinois. In other words, I don't know anything about Nantucket. I do you, but you now know something about how my mind works and how I have fun with metaphors. That's not my favorite chapter of Moby Dick, but that might sound like a weird answer. How about you?
No, that's hilarious. Can you hear it? We're echoing a bit. Is it okay? Okay. What's really funny is you say it, and I have the weirdest chapter that I always think of that I love I'm not even going to be able to say exactly why I do, but it's a chapter called The Hat. Do you know the way? And it's a very weird, very short chapter. And it's just a whole, and Ahab is sort of brooding off the rear of the boat, and all this stuff happened, and he's brooding terribly. And there's this weird moment where a seabird of some kind comes down, and he says he flies thrice round his head like King Tarquin. And the bird snatches his hat off of his head. And there's a great description of the bird flying out, and everybody's standing there watching it. And Ahab's kind of startled. And he flies out, and you just see the dot of his hat get dropped into the ocean by the bird. And it's this idea of his crown being snatched from his head, but it's also kind of funny and absurd. And you have this mighty character, this king leader character, and his hat gets pulled off his head. And it's dumped out at sea by this freaking bird. And for some reason, I love that chapter. I don't know why. But it also has that funny grandiosity of thrice round his head like Tarquin, the eagle snatches his crown. And it's just some dude getting his hat pulled off and dropped in the ocean. Anyway.
It could be that Melville wrote a few chapters when he was not entirely sober.
That's a question I've actually always wondered about him, is that he must have been.
Well, he said to his friend Hawthorne, he said, "I will not believe in a temperance heaven." No, when we go to heaven, there'll be plenty to drink.
I've always wondered that about if he was drinking a lot while he wrote.
But there's a request for you to read something.
Yeah, Paul, and before you do, I might just say to the audience, one way to set this up is that I'll thank Professor Delbanco now, and maybe we'll come down so you can have the stage yourself, so to speak. And
okay.
Maybe just suggest what you'd like to read.
Well, I mean, there's a sort of famous passage from Moby Dick. There's more obscure stuff, but I don't know whether that will interest people. Probably more if I do Moby Dick, something from Moby Dick. I will do. I do want to put in a plug for the book Israel Potter, which nobody reads. I'm going to be Melville's PR flack right now and say it's a shame that more people don't read that book, because it's a great book. And it's a very accessible kind of adventure novel in some ways that he wrote. Anyway, I'm putting in a plug for Israel Potter, but I'll read this passage from Moby Dick.
Thank you. And Paul, when you're done, maybe just say goodnight to everybody.
Okay.
And again, thank you, Andy. And
thank you,
Paul. And thanks for
working with you.
Really a pleasure. Thanks, man.
And, stay well and wash your hands and wear your mask and everything.
Thanks, man.
Okay. Take care.
We'll be listening.
Okay.
Bye.
So you can